Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to talk about Genestealer cults, how they are created, how they ferment within society, and how they eventually rise up to overthrow the shackles of their mostly imperial oppressors. And all in the name of becoming some galactic monster's midnight snack. For that is, of course, the end goal for all good Genestealer cults, to be saved by being absorbed back into the Hive mind's greater whole, by jumping directly into a digestion pit. But the path to suicide by long pig sushi is a long and arduous one, as, by and large, most powers that be in the 41st millennium are not particularly receptive to different opinions and points of views, particularly when those points of views will lead to the mass snackicide of entire civilizations. But hey, we all have our burdens to bear, and the Genestealer cults are no exception. So, where do we get started? Where do we begin our long journey from single Genestealer to planetary domination? Well, as mentioned, you begin with a single Genestealer, or more correctly, a pack of Genestealers, deployed as forward scouts for the tyranid Hive fleets, to discover the location of inhabited worlds rich in biological material to further fuel its conquests. Although, as a bit of a side note here, it was not always so, for the Genestealer cult actually predates the Tyranids themselves. Oh yes, the original Genestealer cult with their rather unforgettable enormous armoured limos, they were around before the Tyranids were even a thing. In fact, the Genestealer cult referred specifically to a cult of chaos, where the Genestealers could become chaos worshippers, including even allying with mutants, beastmen, demons, monsters, yada 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 yada, and forming a full-on chaos force. It was only with... No, not Space Hulk. No, Space Crusade. That was it. That they actually introduced the Tyranids as a part of, well, the Tyranids, or more correctly, introduced the Genestealers as a part of the Tyranids. Now, Advanced Space Crusade was, in essence, the sequel, expansion, quote-unquote, to Space Hulk, which preceded it. And Space Hulk, which also had Genestealers, did not have them as Tyranids. Instead, they were simply a form of Genestealer cults. Whilst in Advanced Space Crusade, they introduced the literal Tyranid warriors. Thus, also, the Tyranids. A bit convoluted, I know, but trust me on this. These days, however, the Genestealers are a well-known advanced organism of the Hive fleets, dispatched, as mentioned, as scouts. When they happen upon a world with a large population group, they will move to begin infiltrating that population by infesting them. And the very first Genestealer to subdue a member of the local populace and infest them also becomes the leader of this expansion effort. The patriarch, as he is thereafter referred to. Mind you as well that the host of the infection does not need to be human. It is simply that the galaxy is primarily made up of humans, and that humans are the most suitable species that the Tyranids have encountered, at least amongst the major ones. But beyond that, the Genestealers are capable of infecting, as far as we know, any species with their mutated genes. Even, in fact, species which it makes no sense whatsoever that they should be able to infect. For example, Genestealer hybrid orcs are a thing, which makes absolutely no sense because only the firstborn child of an infected female becomes a hybrid. So how orcs, who don't breed by giving birth to children could possibly create hybrids, I don't know. Maybe the first clutch of spores they release by, burping, farting, etc., shitting, will become the hybrids? That doesn't really make any sense either, biologically speaking, but okay, but apparently orc hybrids are possible. But orcs can somehow sense the presence of tyranid genes in their fellows. And as it so happens, most of the other races have some form of plot armor protection against this as well. The Tau Ethereals, for example, can notice infiltrators. The Eldar breed so incredibly slowly that infiltrating them is mostly pointless, although it is still possible, and it has been successful on at least one occasion. Necrons are, well, Necrons, duh. And despite being the originators of the Genestealer cults, Chaos, too, is not a very nice infiltration target, largely because Chaos is a bit of an unnerving entity to the Genestealers as well, but again, in theory, it is absolutely possible. Now, for today, we are going to concentrate on how a Genestealer rebellion might work on an Imperial world. It'd be an interesting mental experiment to try and do the same on a Chaos world at some point, but for now, we are going to stick to the most common scenario, and the one with the highest degree chance of actually succeeding: human infiltration. So, let us return to that first pod of Genestealers. After having landed successfully on the planet, they will seek out a population center, a small one to begin with, because the initial objective is one of stealth and infiltration rather than invasion. 24 Genestealers is not going to be enough to take over a planet, after all. They will then seek out and abduct a breeder, a female human, because no matter what the current year is going to tell you, it's very hard to make a man produce a child all by himself. Anywho, once a human female has been infected with the Genestealer's curse, the first Genestealer to do so, pass on the infection, will become the patriarch. This will over time change him both physically and psychologically. He will grow far larger, described as being almost twice the size of a space marine, far stronger, far tougher, and far more difficult to kill. He will also be granted limited psychic powers, first and foremost to enthrall and command future subjects, and secondly to act as a sort of lighthouse beacon for the Hive fleet, though this ability will only activate much later on, when he has the ability to actually undermine the society that he has been placed within. This mutation also drastically increases that Genestealer's lifespan. We don't know for exactly how long, if they're literally immortal or if they're simply very long-lived, but as far as we can tell, they can be at the very least several centuries old. And it does take quite a while for them to grow to their full stature and potency. In all due likelihood, the first few victims must be abducted and de facto held captive until they are ready to give birth, at which point the second stage of the infection takes hold. The victim's firstborn child will then be a first-generation Genestealer hybrid. These are often also referred to as acolytes of the Genestealer cult. These hybrids are either psychically active in their own way on some low level, or the infestation in and of itself rewrites the original host's mind, as the female victim will find this thing to just be the cutest little mutated many-armed monster that has ever popped out of her vagina, and will do next to anything to protect it. The precise relationship between the cult and the parents of various hybrids is a subject that has not been explored a great deal. But due to the psychic powers of the patriarch, I would imagine that once the first generation really starts rolling, the need to imprison the females, the breeding stock if I may be so crude, probably begins to lessen quite a lot. If not, the need disappears almost entirely, I might even imagine, as they will be brainwashed, in effect, to think that these are their perfect little cute children, and so they can, presumably, be relied upon to produce further generations of Genestealer hybrids, or even be reintegrated into society as yet another vanguard of the infiltration effort. As clearly, the Genestealer cults will need actual human representatives as well to fully and successfully infiltrate human society, as even the later generation of Genestealer hybrids are not entirely identical to humans, and can in fact be quite easily spotted if you know what to look for. Now, the earliest generation that we're talking about now, the first generation, are the most obvious ones amongst them all, because they look like a half-formed mix between a Genestealer and a human, and invariably have at least one too many limbs on their upper bodies, and claws and teeth and elongated skulls and what have you. This half-formed mix indicates that the Genestealer's infestation requires a certain period of time to fully adapt to the host body, to begin to mimic it. We also know that a certain amount of genetic information about the host is required for more specialized Genestealer life forms to be created. For example, once the first generation have been made, they can in turn infect further humans to create second generations, which are also broadly referred to as acolytes, as they too are obviously monstrous. And in fact, they can even produce the even more monstrous variants known as the aberrants. Now, these are rarer, more brutish creatures, presumably created for heavy physical labor or as assault shock troops, possibly as an early emergency reaction to the possibility of being discovered. As in this stage of the infiltration, it is all about stealth and secrecy. Unlike Chaos cults, first and second generation Genestealers and their purebloods cannot operate in human society with any degree of secrecy or security. They might be able to form underground crime gangs posing as mutants, essentially, possibly, on larger hive worlds, for example, or on population centers with large mutants substratas of the population, like underhives or swamps or derelict abandoned villages, places with impure genomes. They might be able to pass for simply another form of mutation, but even that is pushing it. And if they ever attract the attention of actually official Arbites, then they're almost certainly done for at this point, as they are not going to have the influence amongst the upper governmental echelons to protect themselves. They are going to have to wage a war all by themselves when their numbers are still probably relatively small, when their mutations are quite crude, and the pure blood Genestealers number no more than a few dozens. If a Genestealer cult is discovered this early, the game is almost certainly up, and so they wish to avoid this at all costs. So whilst operations from a criminal standpoint might be possible, it would be very, very, very risky. That being said, however, some level of operations will still be absolutely necessary. Now, bear in mind, the Genestealers can grow very, very old. The patriarch can grow as old as he damn near wants, as far as we are aware. So they are in no hurry, they don't have to rush this, but they do need to acquire more breeding stock. This, in all due likelihood at this stage, will continue to mean the abduction of human females, which might raise a few eyebrows here and there as well, but bear you in mind, most human planets are rife with crime already. Hell, even in our society, a relatively peaceful and stable one, imagine a Genestealer infestation moving to an area like Afghanistan, or backwater China, for example. You're not going to be hearing about abductions in these areas. And so, the abduction of potentially hundreds, maybe even thousands of women is far from an impossibility. Even more so if, after giving birth to their firstborn, they can be slowly reintegrated into human society after having been adequately brainwashed by the patriarch and by the creation of the first generation. Another concern for the initial infiltration effort is going to be simple goddamn food. It seems like such a base necessity, but, well, you gotta have it, otherwise you'll simply just starve to death. And the more Genestealer hybrids you create, considering they cannot fit into human society, the more food you are going to require. I would imagine that first and foremost they would engage in hunting or predatory behavior, but the thing is, that can only sustain a population so large in so large an area. Once you reach a certain number, you will simply begin over-hunting the area. And if you are on a heavily industrialized world or a hive world, you might not even be able to hunt. Which means you will either need to farm, which might also not be a possibility, and will also expose you to discovery as now you are actually farming land, preparing it, forming it, etc., or you're gonna need to steal it. Which again, considering the quantities of food you are going to need, even with just a few dozen individuals, will place them at tremendous risk yet again, but there really is no other option. Now, I do seem to remember it mentioned somewhere, although take this with a grain of salt, grain of salt, the same thing, that I cannot for the life of me remember precisely where, so the source might be my fevered imagination, but I seem to remember that the Genestealers themselves can enter into some sort of long-term sleep, some sort of, what's the English term? Hibernation, that was it. And if that is possible, and if maybe the initial generation of acolytes can do something approximating it as well, then that would drastically cut down the amount of risk that the cult will have to expose itself to in the early days and years to simply just stay alive. As for how long this period is going to take, well, I don't know. At least I haven't seen any mention of how quickly a early generation Genestealer matures up until the point where it can infect the next host. Now, if this was to be anything, sexual, I would have to say 18 years of age. But since this is in all due likelihood some sort of actual infection, who knows? A year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, a decade, 2 decades? How long does it take for that particular part of the Genestealer to mature? How long does it need to figure out that part of the human biology before it's ready to move on to stage 2, creating a second generation Genestealer, hybrid, quote unquote, or a second generation acolyte? Come to think of it, since the patriarch is hardly in a hurry or anything, it might be better to simply turn a very small number of original first-generation acolytes, maybe only half a dozen or so. It's a small enough number that you're unlikely to be discovered, and it's a small enough number of mouths to feed as well, as to not put too much of a stress on, well, the hybrid acolytes' families, who now basically just have one more son to feed. It's going to delay the whole building an army plan by quite a bit of time, but it would make sure that you'd have a relatively safe time getting to the second generation acolytes. Now, these look a pinch more human than the first generation, although they're still sporting a third limb with enormous slashy claws on it, so Not exactly infiltration material still, but it is one step further down the chain, and grants access to the larger and stronger adherents, which might allow them to start finally beginning to build some sort of underground infrastructure. If the case is that this is on a Hive world, then obviously they would infest the lowest reaches of the Hive planet. Fitting in halfway decently with the local mutant population. They can begin establishing themselves as maybe some sort of a gang, as most hives have dozens upon dozens upon dozens of those already, many of which are likely to be mutants. On other planets, they might create outlaw bands and, well, sort of pseudo try to hide in plain sight, essentially. If the planet has enforcement, which it's going to have, local PDF and local law enforcement at the very least, then you do run the risk if somebody gets captured, then you're gonna look awfully suspicious. But to the untrained eye, these might still look like mutants rather than Genestealers, as the presence of Genestealers, the nature of their infiltrations, etc., are not exactly commonly held knowledge. It's going to be pretty obvious to somebody in the know, like Arbites officers or Inquisitors, obviously, but those are relatively rare and few and far between. Anyways, at this point, the Genestealer Cult will be able to begin building its own little mini-parallel society to that which they are currently trying to take over. They are going to have been able to get themselves labor, and they are going to be able to probably start building up a little bit more securely, although they are by no means safe just yet. Especially as they are going to really need to start to ramp up food production and the ability to support themselves, as well as probably beginning little cottage industries to provide themselves with clothing, with ramshackable weapons potentially. If they're going to go down any sort of banditry or illegality route, they're going to need guns or swords at the very least, or something to help them deal with everybody else who might be encroaching upon their territory. They are also going to, yet again, need yet further breeding stock, so that the second generations will be able to create the first generation of neophytes. This is a crucial make-or-break point for any Genestealer cult, because it is the third generation where they actually begin producing soldiers, leaders, raiders, infiltration specialists, and the forces that are actually going to help them win an insurrectionist campaign. Once this step begins, the cult becomes able to defend itself, and could, at least in theory, survive being revealed, as they now are able to produce their own war leaders, which might be able to manage a strategy to keep the cult alive for long enough for the Hive fleet to arrive and, rescue it. Heavy quotation marks there, but you get the drift, as this is where the Primi can finally arrive. The Primi is usually produced long after this, in the fourth or even when the fifth generation is being created, as he is the highest war leader of a cult, second to the patriarch of course, but theoretically one can now appear in the third generation. This is then also the point where the cult begins to actually plan for its future insurrection. Oh, it is far from ready yet, make no mistake, but it can begin to think about it and plan, because there are a lot of things required before you get a successful insurrection up and running. First and foremost is increasing their own power structure and beginning to lay the foundation for their relative safety. This means producing significant numbers of third generation along with second and first generation hybrids, increasing their breeding stock, beginning to produce their own weaponry if at all possible. In the case of a low-tech world like a feudal planet, then simple melee weaponry might just be good enough. On more complex planets, the machinations or machining, why am I even using machinations? The machining of simple ballistic weaponry which, whilst certainly not good enough, is a start, and requires only relatively rudimentary industrial machining tools. Other weapons, like bombs, can be produced very easily. Even some rudimentary artillery, like mortars, for example, or simple catapults throwing high explosives, can now be created. And since the cult will be beginning the proper establishment of a stronghold, preferably hidden from prying eyes, they can begin establishing a small industrial base. This is unlikely to be anything major because, again, the larger it becomes, the more mouth there is to feed, and the more raw resources you now need to consume as well to produce the weapons and the equipment for your budding army, which again raises the cult's profile. And it is only when the 4th generation comes around, which should now be a relatively safe bet because the cult is beginning to establish its own security with relative efficiency, that they can begin starting to try and infiltrate human society. As the 4th generation or the 2nd generation of neophytes can be mistaken for humans. Not well, mind you, they're still not at the point where they can get into the upper echelons of anything, but they can now begin to operate as a gang with an outwardly facing human appearance, or at the very least some very low-level mutations. This opens up so many doors for the cult, as no longer need they rely on their puppets and their brainwashed servants to do all of the forward-facing business for them. They can use their own specialists and their own individuals to do so instead. This also means that they can take part in far more aggressive operations, as the only things really showing them off as anything Genestealer-esque is the slightly weird cranium, the slightly odd hands and fingers, and the leant-over, hunched posture. These could easily be explained as minor mutations on almost any Imperial world, as all but the purest carry the taint of at least some degree of mutation, and allows the cult, therefore, to act relatively openly, with all the obvious advantages of being able to steal equipment, food, machinery, etc. that includes. You also, in the 4th generation, get the creation of perhaps the single most important individual in the entire cult, perhaps even more important than the patriarch himself, namely the Genestealer Magus. This particular strain only appears in psychically active races, because he is a psyker, and he requires a psyker host. Not necessarily a powerful one, mind you, as the Magus will be far more powerful than his host, but even just a low-level psyker will do. Once the Magus has been created, he can then begin operating almost entirely in the open, as his psychic powers will be able to smooth over any lesser deformations that he might still have, like a derpy-looking skull, or weird fingers, or a little bit of claws, etc. All of these things can be easily covered with but the tiniest of psychic efforts. His psychic powers also allows him to begin recruiting more and more outright humans in influential positions. This is the point at which a cult might often begin to present itself to wider society as a legitimate force, either a political party or a variant of the imperial faith, or some other outward-facing structure, even a large conglomerate or a business, for example, which will be able to use the psychic potential of the Magus to make sure that they receive favorable treatment in all matters of official business. Now, to begin with, there is also only one Magus, but this is not a unique title. In fact, particularly large cults that begin to spread across entire planets can have dozens of Magi. I guess Magi is the correct plural term here. And once scattered across the various branches of the cults, they will also perform the duty of local leadership, as obviously the patriarch can't be everywhere at once, although, well, he kinda can be, because he is a part of a hive mind and can instruct his little Magi to do whatever his filthy, beating tyranid heart desires. And of course, that will be yet more manpower, yet more weaponry, and yet more influence. At this point, the cult can almost certainly secure large swaths of land for their personal expansion. They can probably grow their own food, craft their own materials, even perhaps mine their own resources, etc. This is also where we start getting to see some of the more heavily specialized warfare forms. As mentioned, the Primus War Leader is likely to start appearing around this point. You might also have stuff like the Hybrid Metamorph, and you will be only one step away from further pure breed Genestealers, as they are considered the 5th generation. Though in reality, at that point, we are not creating further generations of hybrids, we are simply returning to the first point again, creating further pure breeds. These exist in part to continue to spread the infestation, although there can be only one patriarch, mind you. But first and foremost, they are the shock troops, the elite enforcers, and the spear tip of the cult's armies. As at this point as well, the cult might be starting to get interested in other forms of soft power, like assassinations, sabotage attempts, steering elections in the correct direction, if they happen to be on a planet that has some elections. And even if it doesn't, well, every planet requires a planetary governor, and who knows, the planetary governor's son might just so happen to be very sympathetic towards the Genestealer cults. Very sympathetic indeed. And then, when an unfortunate accident occurs to his old man, well, you know, the sky's the limit at that point, isn't it? At the point of the 4th generation, this is where it gets really difficult to stop the cult from reaching a critical mass, because this is the point where it will be able to gain real influence, and with real influence comes tremendous increases in security and resources. Now, it can still be a fairly small organization, and if the presence of a Magi is discovered, you bet your ass that all hell is going to be raining down on that planet. Quite possibly literally, in the case of a more trigger-happy Inquisitor. And at this point, the cult will probably already have been operating for, at the very least, decades, probably a century or so, and there might very well be starting to be a lot of hints and indicators and little red warning lights flashing in nearby inquisitorial intelligence centers. But at the same time, the Imperium's really goddamn large, and here's the thing. Simple insurrection, opposition to imperial rule, ideological dissidence, even straight-up militant opposition, none of these things are particularly rare within the Imperium, and it doesn't need to mean anything particularly sinister. Yeah, it could be a Chaos cult, absolutely. It could be a Genestealer cult, but more often than not, the local laborers' militia that tend to take a far more hands-on approach to their activism, well, they're just dissatisfied citizens, as there are plenty of those in the Imperium, and the Imperium tend to take a rather heavy-handed approach to dealing with such dissent, which might in turn require the further application of extreme force to dissuade further revolutionaries, and so on, and so on, and so on. So even if a planet is showing signs of insurrectionist activity, that might not draw any attention whatsoever because, well, every planet is showing some sort of sign of insurrectionist activity. And even if discovered, at this point, the cult will probably have enough military force to defend itself, maybe even start its insurrection, because now we move on to the actual planning of the big day itself. So, what are you going to need when you're trying to take over an entire planet? Well, preferably, you are going to want people in high places. You are going to want the planetary governor. You are going to want leaders of the PDF. You are going to want leaders of local Imperial Guard forces, if any exist, etc., etc. You want as much control over the military might that might be turned against you as, inhumanly, possible. If that isn't possible, or as a substitute or as an addition to it, you need to plan your own military might. Now, all levels of the tyranid infestation, the various hybrids, etc., are, if not particularly competent, then adequate fighters, and they will be fanatically loyal. Even the first generations can be decent enough shock troopers, and with the second, third, and fourth generation, you get people able to engage in modern warfare with firearms and tactics and strategy, etc. Even gaining the ability to create specialized warfare forms, like again the hybrid metamorphs. And if a sufficient number of pure strain Genestealers can also be created, well, you've got some of the best shock troops in the entire galaxy right there. Not to mention infiltration experts. It is a potentially incredibly dangerous force, especially as it will be preparing for this day for a very, very, very long time. The primary goals of the insurrection will be, first and foremost, the seizure of any seats of power that they might be able to use for their own good. If they can turn the military against each other, then yay! If they can sow confusion, yay! Anything and everything they can do to create the appearance of illegitimacy for the real imperial government, they absolutely will do. Secondary priorities include the seizure of industrial facilities. As we already talked about, the cults at this point will undoubtedly have created a decent stockpile of either stolen or homemade weaponry, or weapons that they were able to skim off the top of any weapons production on the planet, or even doing stuff like waylaying Imperial Guard or PDF supplies. Now, a stockpile is nice, but oh, you would be amazed how quickly armies burn through not just ammunition, but weapons, spare parts, lubricants, all of the various things you need to keep a modern army running. Those supplies will dwindle awfully quickly, and so you are going to need access to the ability to replenish those. So industrial centers are going to be the next obvious logical thing to secure. Once those have been secured, you are going to need then access to food and any other potentially vital resources, like water, for example. Clean drinking water on the Hive planet is far, far from guaranteed, and your insurrection is going to be awfully short-lived if everybody begins dying of thirst on day 3. Only when these crucial goals are achieved can the insurrection actually, take aim at winning a war. Now, ideally, no war will be needed. If the head of the planetary government can simply become a Genestealer and then begin building down the PDF, getting rid of Imperial Guard forces, demilitarizing, etc., then that might be good enough. The patriarch will climb to the top of the highest spire and sit there as a nice, big, fat, bloated lighthouse, at this point pulsating violently, as the cult will be in de facto control over the planet, and so the signal that he will be sending out is food, 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 easy food, 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 and so on, which might attract Hive fleets pretty damn quickly, in fact. And if the cult has done their job well enough, then when the Hive fleet arrives in orbit, well, you're not gonna need to fight a long war because Hive fleet's gonna take care of that. Your job is pretty much done at that point. But in a situation where a war might be necessary, or alternatively desirable, because of course there are situations in which a portion of the galaxy, a planet, whatever, is simply too far away from any other Tyranid Hive fleets to really be nommed in any decent period of time, but it might be occupying a strategically important part of the galaxy, where an interruption of services might severely hamper the Imperium's war efforts, and the Hive mind is absolutely intelligent enough to recognize this. It might even create roaming armies of reverse crusaders that might go from one planet to the other, overrunning local governments, causing all kinds of chaos and havoc, and drawing off tremendous amounts of resources and manpower from the front lines. Now, at that point, we're going a little bit beyond the limits of this video, so we're not going to entertain that notion too much, but to return to the uprising. Once the plans had been made to seize all of the vitally important things, nourishment, water, infrastructure, industry, and, of course, the halls of power, then it's just to sit and wait, build up all of the forces possible, as much as possible, whilst weakening the enemy as much as possible, while staying, again, as secretive as possible. Because, once more, the patriarch is not rushing here. If waiting another 50 years will produce a better result, and the Tyranid Hive fleet isn't desperately requiring that planet right now, or there even aren't anyone nearby, well, you'll take the extra 50 years and guarantee success. But if this is not an option, and the insurrection must be launched immediately, say for example if the cult had been spotted and detected, then it would be as violent as possible, as quick and as overwhelming as possible, with Genestealers and hybrids pouring forth from the woodwork on every achievable level of the planet, inside of PDF Forces barracks, on every level of a Hive city, inside of the senatorums and the Imperial government buildings, slaughtering officials, leaders, scribes, logistic personnel, officers, anything and everything. Assassination orders will of course be prioritized against governmental leaders or people who might be able to organize some sort of a resistance. Ideally, the planet, once day one is over, will be in such a shambles that the otherwise relatively unorganized cultists can overrun the remaining resistance. Because that's the thing, of course. The cults cannot conduct large-scale training operations. Obviously, that will reveal them very, very quickly. And so in terms of actual organization and regimented ability to fight as one, well, they can rely to a degree on their inherent Tyranid brood telepathy, of course, but they are not probably going to be a match for a open and trained Imperial Guard or even PDF formation, not unless they've had a real lot of time to prepare. So surprise and shock of action is their primary resource. And it can absolutely be a devastating one. Again, if you know where all of the PDF forces are, well, there's no reason why you can't simply bomb their barracks, or set up heavy weapons outside them and pour fire down upon them. There's no reason why you can't ambush patrols as they're making their rounds, thinking nothing's going on. There's no reason why you can't kill their leaders, sending them into a headless spiral. There's no reason why you can't have half of society shooting at shadows before you've even revealed your true military force. And even if the insurrection fails to take control of the planet near immediately, the fact that the cult is now able to operate in the open means that it can begin transitioning over to a regular army. Now that there's no reason to hide, they can take the time needed to properly drill and train their troops, to properly build the infrastructure and industry they need, to properly take whatever remaining precautions they need, and then wage essentially a conventional war against the defenders. Now this does have some risks, because the defenders might take the Krieg option, for example, and simply nuke the hell out of their very own planets. That's one. The second one is that you can bet your happy little ass that there is a lot of distress signals being sent out right now. And whilst the Tyranids are to a degree able to prevent these from being sent out, that is not a foolproof strategy. And even no contact is a sign of danger in and of itself. If a planet suddenly completely falls off the grid, then that in and of itself will not create an immediate reaction in the rest of the Imperium, because it happens for reasons of warp interference, for reasons of local storms, for reasons of just shitty communications, for reasons of not reporting often enough. There can be years between contact between systems and nothing is wrong. So it could still take years and years before anyone outside the planet begins raising some questions as to what the hell is happening. You might also have the problem, of course, with a multi-planet system. Perhaps the revolution works out just fine on planet A, but not on planet B. Alright? Now you've got the added danger of them simply popping into the warp and telling everybody else physically. So you need to get to overrunning that planet as quickly as humanly possible, meaning you need ships, meaning you need transportation, meaning you need logistics, etc., etc. And again, as mentioned, there are cults who operate on this large of a scale that literally have war fleets, which they are not well suited for, because again, the entire idea of a cult is to overrun the planet quickly or destabilize it to a point where it becomes easy pickings for a tyranid Hive fleet, after which the entire cult will simply just be devoured. So having them operate long-term as a military formation is not really what the Hive fleet has planned, but I mean, they're free troops, so might as well. They'll get to eat them eventually, when they get around to it. And at this point, of course, stopping the cult is, well, it's almost pointless, but the best ways to stop a cult. Let's briefly address that as well, shall we? Now, obviously, the best way is to discover it as early as possible, preferably so early that the patriarch hasn't even evolved to his final form yet, in which case local PDF, Imperial Guard forces, or what have you, even local police forces or Arbites might very well be enough to crush the cult relatively quickly. Even a cult on the second or even third stage can probably be taken care of by local forces. Fourth and fifth, this is when stuff starts getting rather difficult, as you're probably looking at a full-scale civil war here. In this case, killing the leaders of the cult is your best bet. The Magi's themselves are of course relatively weak, being psychers, they're hardly defenseless, but they can be killed, absolutely. And killing a Magi will destabilize the local network, but what you really want is, of course, the Patriarch. Now, even killing the Patriarch will not kill the entire cult. It will simply confuse and behead them for a period of time until the next second oldest Genestealer in line can ascend to the position of new Patriarch, a process that could take... God Emperor alone knows. I imagine it would also depend on how many Magi survive, as many of them would be able to take temporary command until the new Patriarch rises to take overall supreme command again. Obviously, you would like to do this via, conventional armed forces if possible, or even better really, if the cult is detected and it is so far along that you don't really want to risk an overt military confrontation, then assassination is your best bet. The Officio Assassinarum obviously have the ability to carry out such missions, or you might be able to rely on specialized strike forces of Imperial Guard stormtroopers, a Inquisitor's retinue, or the Death Watch, even better, as, well, it is kind of literally their job to take care of Xenos threats just like this. Other Astartes forces will also do just dandy because, well, a Space Marine's a Space Marine, and you'll take them if they're offering. But if you're just relying on local PDF, good luck, as they are, in general, in most cases, de facto militia forces. Now, there are worlds that are an exception to this rule. In fact, some of them can have even better quality PDF than the Imperial Guard, but yeah, if you have to rely on PDF to assassinate a Patriarch, you better be damn lucky, and you better pray very, very insistently. As a side note, a last side note to the side note, in fact, the general approach of this will probably remain more or less the same in most examples. Again, it would vary to a degree, like orcs, for example. You're probably going to have a far harder time hiding, so you're going to want to kick off the insurrection a lot earlier. With the Eldar, you're probably not going to have a chance because of the time it takes to corrupt Eldar bodies. With stuff like Tau, again, you're on the clock before the local ethereal, I was about to say Farseer, begins smelling you out, or even the Kroot. The Kroot have the ability as well to detect Genestealer hybrids pretty gosh darn easily. And with Chaos, well, Chaos is probably your second best bet after humans, but even then, You are surrounded by psykers at that point. Very good psykers who, well, have dedicated their entire lives to chaos. And they can probably smell the difference on you. Yeah. Basically, in every other situation, the Genestealers are going to have to act a hell of a lot faster, and are probably going to have to simply give up the idea of subterfuge, hoping instead to seize control over a small portion of the planet, and then begin building up their forces, whilst carrying out a small-scale guerrilla war against everybody else on the planet. Far from ideal circumstances, but, yeah, beggars can't always be choosers. And with all of that being said, I'll wrap it up right here. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and hopefully you've got a little bit of a better understanding of how a Genestealer cult might foment rebellion, glorious revolution on the planets of the Imperium. Have a good day.